Left-wing pianist publicly dares JD Vance to play. He regrets it the moment the music starts. The air inside the Willard Intercontinental Hotel crackled with political electricity chandeliers, gleamed like camera flashes, tuxedos mingled with tailored suits, and somewhere, champagne glasses clinked beneath murmured conversations about power, policy, and polling. This wasn't just any DCGALA, it was the event where reputations were made, or broken. Among the crowd moved Senator JD Vance, the steel-eyed conservative from Ohio, his presence commanding but understated. A former Marine and best-selling author turned political firebrand, Vance had become a symbol of working-class grit, unpolished, unwavering, and unapologetically MAGA. Tonight, he wasn't here to debate, just to observe, shake hands, and, ideally, avoid spectacle. But spectacle had its own plans. The double doors swung open with unnecessary drama. In strode Sebastian Moreau, a liberal darling, internationally praised concert pianist, and outspoken critic of conservative America. Draped in designer confidence and ideological smugness, Sebastian carried himself like the room belonged to him. In his mind, it did. He didn't greet anyone. He didn't need to. His eyes scanned the space until they locked on JD Vance. And then it began. "Senator Vance," Sebastian called out, his voice deliberately loud, dripping with theatrical arrogance. "I've heard you're quite skilled at hammering policy, but can you strike a chord that doesn't sound like a campaign slogan?" The crowd chuckled uneasily. Some phones lifted, always ready to capture a downfall. JD didn't move. He simply looked at him, calm, unreadable. Sebastian smirked, gliding toward the grand piano in the corner like a general approaching the battlefield. "Tell me, Senator," he continued, tapping the keys with casual disdain, "do you know the difference between real art and noise disguised as patriotism?" This was no innocent jab. This was a public trap, a spectacle, premeditated, designed to ridicule. But JD didn't flinch. He never did. Beside him, Clara Jennings, his no-nonsense aide, leaned in, whispering, "It's bait, sir. Ignore it. One bad note, and tomorrow's headline writes itself." JD's jaw flexed ever so slightly. The Marine in him recognized the challenge. The Appalachian kid in him recognized the condescension. And somewhere, deep within, a part of him stirred that hadn't seen daylight in years. A part with 10 fingers and a memory of piano keys. The room hadn't gone silent, but it had grown sharper, like a wire pulled taut, moments from snapping. Sebastian leaned against the grand piano like it was his throne, fingers idly pressing dissonant keys, their echo mocking the silence between his words. "Come on, Senator," he said, a grin playing at his lips. "You talk a lot about American greatness. How about you show some? Or is your talent limited to sound bites and Senate floor dramatics?" A wave of laughter, hesitant and thin, rippled through the liberal side of the room. The conservative end remained still, stone-faced, uneasy. JD didn't answer, not right away. He looked past Sebastian, through the ornate windows of the Willard, at the night-covered Capitol building beyond. His breath slowed. Somewhere in the distance, a memory stirred, unexpected, unwelcome, and stubborn. It wasn't a memory of war, or law school, or debates on Fox News. It was a piano, an old one, walnut finish, keys yellowed and chipped. It stood in his grandmother's living room in Middletown, Ohio. No one had played it in years until a boy with calloused hands and a mind full of chaos sat down one night and tried to make sense of the world through music. That boy was him. He hadn't touched a piano since law school. Life had pulled him away, first the Marines, then Yale, then politics. He'd buried that part of himself beneath speeches, bills, and hard truths. Music was vulnerable. And in Washington, vulnerability was ammunition. Clara's voice broke through his thoughts, sharp and low. "Senator, this is a no-win setup. If you fail, they'll hang it around your neck for a decade." JD turned to her. She wasn't wrong. But failure wasn't the real fear. Exposure was. To play meant revealing something the world didn't expect, that beneath the tough exterior of a working-class warrior, there was art and feeling and fragility. The very things his enemies would weaponize. But to walk away? That would be worse. Not for the headlines, but for the boy in that old living room, who once believed music could mean something, even when the world didn't listen. He looked back at Sebastian, whose eyes were now gleaming with triumph, convinced he'd struck the right chord. And that's when JD knew this wasn't about the piano, it was about identity, about proving that depth didn't belong to one side of the aisle. That feeling wasn't weakness, that a conservative could be more than a soundbite or a slogan. It was about reclaiming something. He adjusted his cuffs, took a breath, and stepped forward. I didn't come here to perform, JD said, his voice calm, steady. But since you insist on testing what makes a man real, why don't we let the music decide? A hush fell. Even Sebastian blinked, his grin faltering, just slightly. JD approached the piano, and the room held its breath. JD Vance stood still in front of the piano, not yet seated, not yet defeated. For a long moment, he didn't touch a thing. He simply stood there, letting the silence grow uncomfortable, deliberate. In that silence, the audience murmured, shifted in their shoes. Phones were raised not to celebrate, but to capture humiliation in real time. Across the room, Sebastian Moreau watched like a director behind the curtain of a Broadway play. His arms folded, posture smug, ready for the scene he had orchestrated, the senator's public embarrassment. A conservative drowning in a sea of keys and expectations. Clara Jennings, JD's aide, stood just off to the side, her arms crossed tightly against her chest, eyes sharp with worry. She mouthed something he didn't catch. Maybe it was don't, maybe it was be careful. Either way, it didn't matter. The decision had already been made. JD sat down. The bench groaned quietly under his weight. The polished black keys reflected the chandelier light above like obsidian mirrors. JD looked at them for a heartbeat, then placed his fingers lightly, barely a whisper, on middle C. He closed his eyes. There, in the darkness behind his lids, the hotel lobby vanished. The weight of policy, of culture wars, of cameras and campaign donors and think pieces disappeared. Instead, he was 12 years old again, sitting at the battered upright in Mama's living room, pressing down gently on the only escape he had from a world that never gave him silence. His family had thought it strange a boy like him, calloused from chores and survival, making something as soft and intricate as music, but he never forgot how it made him feel, calm, capable, in control. JD Vance took a breath. Then, he played. The first notes were hesitant, like a man waking up in a room he hadn't entered in decades. He chose Rhapsody in Blue not just for its power or popularity, but for what it meant, chaos controlled, America's contradictions composed into art. The exact metaphor for who he was and who Sebastian thought he wasn't. The crowd leaned in. The mocking buzz began to dull, replaced by something heavier, uncertainty. Sebastian smirked, arms crossed, but his fingers had stopped drumming. Clara stopped breathing. JD's left hand anchored deep chords, rough but rooted, like the hills of southern Ohio. His right climbed carefully through the melody, rediscovering fluency with each bar. At first it was memory, then it was movement, then it was music, true music. His posture changed. Shoulders unlocked, hands stretched wider. His rhythm steadied, then accelerated. The piece took shape like a fire rekindled. Eyes began to widen. Even the skeptics, with X accounts at the ready, paused their snark. Phones were still raised, but no longer to mock. Now they were recording history. Sebastian's smile evaporated inch by inch. JD played not as a senator, not as a symbol, but as a man reclaiming something stolen by time, by pressure, by image. His fingers rolled across the keys like they'd never left. It wasn't flawless, but it was raw, real, and rising. The melody surged through the space, bursting past politics and labels, reaching somewhere human that no speech ever could. By the time he reached the second movement, the crowd had fallen entirely silent. Only the music remained. No one coughed. No one shifted. Clara had a hand over her mouth now, eyes wide. Disbelief melted into something else, pride, maybe even reverence. One elderly senator in the back, a man not known for praise, stood slowly, jaw slack. Another whispered to a colleague, "I didn't know he could do that." The response was hushed. Neither did he. Then came the climax. JD poured himself into it, brows furrowed, head tilted, body moving slightly with the storm of chords. The fierce glissandos erupted like declarations across the room. Each note struck not just the keys, but the assumptions every person in that lobby had carried into the night. This was not the JD Vance they thought they knew. And it wasn't the version he had allowed himself to become. With the final rising notes of Rhapsody in Blue, JD leaned into the sound, his heart echoing in every vibrating string, in every held breath around him. Then he stopped. His fingers hovered above the keys. The final chord lingered in the air like smoke, hot, indelible, and utterly undeniable. And the room remained frozen. One heartbeat, two, three. Then applause. Thunderous. Uncontainable. Not polite claps or party line loyalty, but real, human awe. Cheers mixed with disbelief, as if the crowd was unsure whether they had just witnessed vulnerability or power. The truth? They had witnessed both. Phones were still recording, but no longer for ridicule. The story had rewritten itself mid-performance. JD slowly stood from the bench, breathing hard. His expression unreadable, but his eyes were bright, alive, seen. Sebastian Moreau didn't move. He stared, unmoving, jaw set, lips tight. It was the look of a man who had made a fatal miscalculation and knew it. He had called for a public shaming. Instead, he had handed JD Vance a stage. Sebastian clapped once, then again. But it was too late. His slow, sarcastic rhythm was swallowed by the roar of genuine ovation all around him. His performance had ended before it began. JD turned away from the piano, eyes scanning the room. He didn't grin. He didn't gloat. He simply nodded once, like a soldier, acknowledging a completed mission, and stepped back toward Clara, whose mouth was still slightly open. "You scared the hell out of me," she muttered, voice low. But that was. He gave a faint smile, adjusting his jacket. "That," JD said softly, "was the sound of remembering who you are." The applause didn't just erupt, it detonated. JD Vance stood near the edge of the piano, his pulse still thrumming in his ears as if the music hadn't stopped. He looked out across the Willard Intercontinental's grand lobby, once humming with ridicule, and now bursting with something else entirely: respect, even shock. The audience had changed. They weren't just clapping for the song. They were clapping because their assumptions had collapsed, because a man they thought they'd boxed in had just smashed through the walls with a Steinway grand and a forgotten memory. A senator had become an artist. A fighter had become a creator. And most importantly, a political opponent had become human. Clara was the first to speak, her voice hushed, but buzzing with disbelief. "That wasn't just good," she whispered. "That was war through melody." JD didn't answer. He was still catching his breath, physically, emotionally. His hands, once trembling before the first note, now felt loose, alive. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was carrying his story like a burden. He'd played it, released it, transformed it, and the world had felt it. Somewhere near the back, Senator Mitchell Reeves, a seasoned conservative from Kentucky, with a bark louder than his bite, stood and pumped a fist in the air. "That's our JD!" he shouted, voice crackling with enthusiasm. "Hell of a speech without saying a damn word!" The room erupted again. Smiles, shoulder pats, laughter of relief. Even a few liberal attendees looked unsure of how to respond. Some clapped, hesitant but honest. Others folded their arms, eyes darting to Sebastian Moreau, as if trying to recalibrate their talking points. And then, like a second wave of aftershock, phones, hundreds of them, recording, uploading, captioning. Within minutes, the first clips hit X, formerly Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube Shorts. Senator JD Vance silences, liberal pianist, with stunning Gershwin performance, hashtag Vance plays thread, how JD Vance just shattered a stereotype in 4 minutes flat. Conservative influencers seized the moment like sharks catching scent of fresh blood. While libs were mocking him, Ed JD Vanceone was quietly preparing to own the room. That's what class looks like. Real patriot voice. He didn't just play piano. He played their egos like a fiddle at Truthhammer. Within an hour, the hashtag Vance plays was trending nationally. Some neutral observers, not known for aligning with JD, chimed in with reluctant admiration. Not a fan of his politics, but credit where it's due, Senator Vance can really play. And he just won over half that room. At Policy Nerd Kate, of course, the backlash came too expected. But toothless, a piano doesn't fix MAGA's broken policies. Don't be fooled by theatrics. Progressive pulse, but it couldn't undo the moment. because the moment was real, unscripted, unrehearsed, undeniable. Even Sebastian's supporters struggled to spin it. In one corner of the room, Lena Hartman, an independent journalist with a reputation for brutal objectivity, leaned toward a colleague and whispered, "I came here expecting a takedown. Instead, I watched a man rise." Sebastian Moreau, for his part, had withdrawn to the far end of the lobby. He stood with a small group of progressive artists and DC creatives who usually buzzed around him like satellites. But tonight, they orbited in uncomfortable silence. A woman in a green silk dress, Mira, one of his close friends, spoke first, voice low. "You misjudged him." Sebastian said nothing. He sipped his drink like it might wash down the humiliation. He had launched a public challenge and been publicly eclipsed, not by a fellow artist, but by the very image of conservative America he had spent his career mocking. The irony was too perfect, too painful. "You played yourself," someone muttered behind him. He didn't turn around. Meanwhile, JD stood by the edge of the crowd, fielding handshakes, compliments, and pats on the back with the distant warmth of someone whose mind was elsewhere. He wasn't thinking about X or headlines. He was thinking about the boy in Middletown, the one who sat at a beaten-up piano and tried to play away the noise in his house, the yelling, the silence, the fear. He was thinking about the version of himself who once believed sensitivity was a flaw, that being good at something like music made you less of a man, less of a warrior. But tonight proved otherwise. He had stood his ground not with policy, or politics, or defense, but with a piece of himself that had never been meant for the public eye. And that piece had spoken louder than any speech he'd ever written. Clara leaned close again. "They're calling you the Patriot Pianist. And," she glanced at her phone, "you just passed 50,000 likes in 15 minutes. JD raised an eyebrow. "Huh, that's all you've got to say?" He gave a half smile. "Better that than Rhino with rhythm," Clara chuckled, then grew serious. "You know this doesn't just go away, right? Tomorrow you're going to be everywhere. Trending. Headlines. Pundits dissecting whether music makes you more relatable to swing voters." JD exhaled. He knew. But at this moment, he didn't care about polls or optics. He was still hearing the last chord fade inside his mind, still feeling the echo of something he thought he'd lost forever, his center. Later that night, he returned to his modest home outside DC, a far cry from the marble and gold luxury of the Willard, but quiet, warm, real. His wife, USHA, was on the couch with their toddler asleep against her shoulder. When JD walked in, she looked up, saw his face, and said simply, "You did it, didn't you?" He sat beside her, gently lifting his son into his arms. "I didn't mean to, but yeah," she smiled softly. "They'll try to politicize it, you know. They already are. But tonight," she said, brushing a lock of hair from her face, "you reminded them you're not just a mouthpiece. You're a man with layers. That's something they'll never be able to unsee." JD nodded, staring at the baby in his arms. Then, almost absent-mindedly, he stood and walked over to the upright piano in the corner of the living room. It had been a housewarming gift years ago, rarely touched, always noticed. He sat down, cracked his knuckles, and played. Not Rhapsody in Blue this time, just a quiet melody. Simple, clean, his. The next morning, Sebastian Moreau sat in a dark cafe just a few blocks from the Willard Intercontinental. His posture, usually poised and self-possessed, was now slightly hunched. The cappuccino in front of him had long gone cold, so had the fire in his expression. His phone buzzed relentlessly beside him. Mentions, notifications, reposts. He didn't need to look. He already knew. The night before was everywhere. JD Vance's piano performance had gone viral beyond viral. It was trending, not just in political spheres, but in the cultural space Sebastian had long believed to be his own. Vance Plays was still climbing, over 3 million views on a single video in under 12 hours. Headlines popped up faster than he could avoid them. JD Vance strikes back with Gershwin, the MAGA maestro, a conservative who can actually play. Sebastian's setup becomes Vance's virtuoso moment. Sebastian scrolled through a few comments, couldn't help himself. He called out JD like it was a gladiator match. And JD gave us Beethoven in boots. Sebastian tried to humiliate a senator. Instead, He woke up a pianist. Turns out you can love your country and still play Rhapsody in Blue better than a coastal elitist. He turned the phone face down and leaned back, the old wooden chair creaking beneath him. He wanted to dismiss it, wanted to call it manipulation, a distraction, a trick. But none of those labels fit. Because what JD had done wasn't a gimmick, it wasn't calculated, it wasn't scripted, it was real, and real was dangerous. Real was the one thing you couldn't spin. Sebastian's thoughts were interrupted as someone approached Lena Hartman, the independent journalist from the gala. She slid into the seat across from him, her coffee in hand, not bothering to ask if she could join. "Rough morning?" she asked, tone even. He didn't answer. She looked him over, then added, "You know, it wasn't the playing that beat you." Sebastian finally looked up, jaw tight. "Oh? What was it then?" It was the fact that everyone expected him to flinch. And instead, he showed them something they didn't believe he was capable of. You tried to shrink him, and he expanded. Sebastian's eyes narrowed. He's still JD Vance. He still pushes policies that destroy the people he pretends to fight for. Lena shrugged. Maybe, maybe not. But last night, he reminded the country that being conservative doesn't mean being hollow. That humanity isn't exclusive to your side. Silence hung between them. "You played the wrong game," Lena said quietly. And he played the long one. Across town, JD Vance sat in his Senate office, different suit, same stillness. He was back in the trenches. Bills to review, meetings to schedule, statements to prepare. But everything felt just a little different. Not because of fame, he didn't care about that. It was something deeper, something had shifted. He noticed it in how staffers greeted him. No longer with mere professionalism, but with something akin to awe. He noticed it in the tone of morning media. It's less venomous, more cautious. And he noticed it most in Clara, who stood in the doorway holding a folder but said nothing until he looked up. "They want you on 5 networks today. All of them." CNN even asked twice. JD raised an eyebrow. "Let's not get carried away," she smirked. "They're not calling to debate. They're calling to watch you breathe on air and see if you spontaneously combust into sheet music." He shook his head. "Let it cool off. If we chase it, it'll look like a stunt." She hesitated, then stepped inside. But it wasn't, was it? He looked at her. No. She placed the folder on his desk, then turned to go, but paused at the door. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not for the politics. For the proof that someone like you, someone like us, can be more." JD didn't respond. He didn't need to. The silence said it all. Later that evening, JD returned home. The sky outside was turning amber, streaked with the last remnants of a late March sun. Inside, Usha was reading by the window, and their son was playing with a tiny toy car on the rug. JD sat next to her, letting the quiet settle between them, like old friends. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said finally. "You didn't," Usha replied, not looking up from her book. "That's why it mattered." He nodded slowly, watching his son push the car across invisible roads only he could see. "There's a danger in this, JD murmured. "They'll try to use it as proof that I'm something I'm not. Or worse proof that I've changed." Usha closed the book and turned to him. "Have you?" JD thought for a long moment. "No," he said. "But maybe I remembered something I forgot." She reached out and touched his hand. "That's good enough." The next day, a piece appeared in The Atlantic, not by a conservative commentator, but by a centrist columnist known for skeptical takes on populist figures. The title read, "The Night JD Vance Played Rhapsody in Blue and Changed the Conversation." The final paragraph read, "In a polarized era, we forget that leaders can be whole, that they carry histories not shaped by ideology, but by family, fear, struggle, and love." JD Vance didn't become someone new that night at the piano. He simply revealed someone old, someone American. And in doing so, he didn't just strike a chord. He became one. Sebastian read the article that night alone, then opened his social media one last time. He hovered over the new post button. He thought about tweeting something snarky, a deflection, a line about art versus politics. But then, he didn't. He closed the app. And for the first time in years, Sebastian Moreau sat down at his own piano, not to provoke, not to impress, just to play. Epilogue. What echoes endure weeks past. The clip of JD's Performance became a symbol used by the right as proof of depth and by the center as a reminder that labels can't hold back talent. The left, though bruised, moved on, already searching for the next takedown. But JD Vance didn't care. He wasn't trying to win anymore. He was trying to be whole. And somewhere in the halls of Congress, under the weight of arguments, amendments, and agendas, that same senator who had once buried his love of music beneath duty and expectation could now sometimes be heard humming softly in the elevator. No cameras, no crowd, just memory, just music.